All right, y'all, welcome to the Kyle Kulinski Abortion Hour. No, but in all seriousness, that's what the overwhelming majority of today's show is. I think I have over a dozen stories. Maybe about 10 of them are focused on the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So I want to give you every angle to this. I want to tell you what's going on with Joe Biden and the Democrats. I want to tell you what's going on with the people. I want to tell you what the Republicans are planning to do. I want to show you some pretty cringe debates that happened on this issue in mainstream media. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll tell you guys the way that this should be dealt with. I'll tell you guys what Biden should do, what the Democrats should do, and a bunch of people said some pretty insightful stuff on this issue over the weekend. So first, let me show you this thread, because I feel like this is a little bit of a history lesson for people to be reminded that it's possible to fight back when something like this happens. Because a lot of people seem resigned. They seem resigned to the fact that the Supreme Court ruled, and they feel like, well, that might be the end of it. What avenues do we have from here? It is a historical misnomer to think, well, now we have to lay in a chalk outline of ourselves. So Kevin Elliott did this phenomenal thread. He said, "For the love of God, politically interested people, when your friends and family ask what can be done about the Supreme Court, don't say nothing. There are moldering away in the Constitution ways to check the court's power that every American needs to become familiar with. Formally, the Constitution allows Congress to, number one, impeach justices." More on that a little bit later. Number two, strip the Supreme Court of jurisdiction over everything but its original jurisdiction. Number three, increase or decrease the court's size. And number four, begin the amendment process. Now, number one and number four are dead because they require supermajorities in Congress to use, and no such majorities are forthcoming. By the way, even if there was a supermajority, we all know Democrats wouldn't lift a finger in this direction. But 2 and 3 can be accomplished by ordinary legislation, which is currently blocked by the filibuster, which is another problem. Now, the other portion of this is the filibuster can be overturned with 51 votes. So the idea that we have to be resigned to keeping the filibuster is nonsense. Even the idea that we could just do some simple workarounds to the filibuster. You don't even need to fully get rid of the filibuster, even though you should. You don't even need to fully get rid of the filibuster to do some of these things. So again, he's saying number 2 and number 3 are the ones that are on the table. Strip the Supreme Court of jurisdiction over everything but its original jurisdiction, and increase or decrease the court size. He continues, "There have also been lots of other ways considered to check the court. New Deal Democrats came up with a whole bunch of creative ideas." So let me show you what we have here. "Proposals to create new vacancies on the Supreme Court were the preferred method of court curbing for some members of Congress, whether by increasing the size of the court to 11 or 15, mandating retirement age at 65 or 70, or establishing 10-year terms for judges. Other bills address the issue of judicial review, including some that would have forbidden it altogether. Senator George Norris proposed an amendment that would require the agreement of 7 justices in order to declare a federal law unconstitutional." Now that's interesting. Then endorsed a bill mandating unanimity. La Follette wanted to empower the president to demand advisory opinions from the court regarding the constitutionality of proposed federal statutes. At one time or another, Roosevelt was attracted by almost all of these ideas, including composite measures in one bill to allow the president and Congress to demand, receive, and reject advisory opinion from the court, or in another to repass an overturned law after an intervening congressional election. Ultimately, he decided to adopt the essential elements of still another composite that Edward S. Corwin suggested in correspondence with Attorney General Homer Cummings. It stipulated that whenever the court included half or more justices who were 70 years or older, a new justice could be appointed for each justice in his 70s who declined to retire. So I think the most interesting idea to me among those is this idea that you need a unanimous decision in order to overturn federal law. That's interesting. So it's saying, look, you can't do 5-4, 6-3. It's got to be unanimous if you're going to overturn a federal law. Or you mandate that, hey, judicial review is an advisory opinion. Because a lot of people don't realize Marbury versus Madison is the big decision, that early Supreme Court decision, which decided, hey, we have judicial review, which means the Supreme Court can check the constitutionality of laws. But it didn't have to be decided that way. It could have went the other way, in which case the court wouldn't have the ability to do judicial review, wouldn't have the ability to check the constitutionality of various laws. Now, again, more on that in a little bit, because there's history in the United States which shows that there were certain instances throughout history where the court acted up, where the court made an obviously incorrect decision. And then you had, FDR did something about it. Abraham Lincoln did something about it. Again, more on that in a minute. It's super important, because this notion of you must care about our American institutions and you must follow the history of the country. Well, if you are following the history of the country, and if you do care about American institutions, sometimes the move is to get the court in check. Because, number one, they're going to lose legitimacy. Number two, they have no enforcement mechanism for anything that they declare. So again, more on that in a second. There's no constitutional reason, for instance, why the court wouldn't be forced to issue advisory opinions, pre-binding itself to definite legal interpretations. President Washington requested exactly that, and just in a memo, the court said, nah. That's fascinating. So George Washington said, no, you guys are giving me advisory opinions. And the court was like, no, we think it's more serious than that. But they responded to Washington in an advisory opinion, and that's what he says now. In 1793, George Washington administration asked the Supreme Court for help navigating a bunch of difficult legal issues with some advisory opinions. The court said, we don't do that, but they did it in an advisory opinion. That's what some would call a performative contradiction. It may also surprise lots of normies that the Constitution doesn't actually grant the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. So a law strictly curtailing that power, such as by requiring unanimity on the court for overriding legislation or otherwise regulating it, could work. One of the most popular ideas for checking the Supreme Court today is to limit the term of justices, either by amending the Constitution to introduce a limit, or by passing a law that requires them to rotate off the Supreme Court and onto a circuit court after some number of years. Finally, another way to check the court is to just pass ordinary legislation that does the opposite of whatever they decide. They overturn Roe, Congress codifies it. They overturn Obergefell, that's gay marriage, by the way. Congress restores marriage equality. The thing about all these ways to check the Supreme Court is that if any of them actually became credible threats, got talked about, and actively pursued in Congress with a real chance of passage, that could itself force the court to back down. This is actually what happened the last time the court's position was seriously threatened with a check during FDR's effort to pack the court. The conventional wisdom about FDR's efforts to pack the Supreme Court is that it was a huge error that backfired. But this is entirely wrong. He threatened to check the court using perfectly constitutional powers in line with checks and balances, and it worked. They changed views. So just a threat worked and made them change views. The main thing to take away from this is that there's nothing that can be done about the court. But we need to specifically name the strategies that are open to us. We need to talk about them a lot, fight about the details, and demand our representatives pursue specific ones. So great thread there from Kevin Elliott. Now I have more for you. This is from Moshe Temkin. I will repeat this as long as I have to. When the Supreme Court said in 1937, my dyslexia is showing up, that the Social Security Act was unconstitutional. By the way, pause. How many of you knew that? The Supreme Court said the Social Security Act was unconstitutional. How many knew that? FDR didn't ask people to vote harder in the next election. He told the court that he'd add more justices until they backed off, which they did. If you want to understand why liberals always lose, even when they win, read the responses from the dudes who think the only difference between FDR and Biden is how many Democratic senators there were. Really sad stuff. Now, I like this because this guy gets into a specific back and forth where he, fights back against this notion that is fundamentally incorrect. So Alan Plotzker says, are you serious? Republicans had 17 Senate seats and 20.2% of the House in 1937. FDR had the power to do that because people had just voted to give him staggeringly large majorities in Congress. To which Moshe Temkin responds, people pointing out that FDR won in huge landslides in 1936 and had big congressional majorities. Have you ever considered that his leadership in the 4 years of his first term and his willingness to fight for the people had something to do with that? Maybe there's a lesson here. Correct. So it's this self-fulfilling prophecy of defeatism. And at no point do they want to break that chain by actually fighting for the people, which would then in turn grow the majorities, which would give them more power. And also we'll get to more of this in a little bit. But on this particular issue, if you know the history, It's an ironclad fact that Biden just doesn't care that much about abortion. If anything, he sort of leans right in many respects. Again, more on that later. Now let me give you this. Some historical context. Now we're going to talk about Lincoln and what Lincoln did. Some historical context. In 1857, the Supreme Court heard a case called Dred Scott versus Sanford, and their ruling stated that black people were not and could not ever be considered citizens of the United States, and that additionally, they had no human rights at all. Seems like a pretty extreme decision. In the same ruling, the court, dominated by a partisan majority hailing from slaveholding southern states, also declared that Congress had no right to ban slavery. So how did the next president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, respond to this? For one thing, in 1863, President Lincoln and his allies in Congress expanded the judiciary, adding more Supreme Court justices to try to counteract its partisan state. The exact same thing that many people have been begging the Democrats to do now, but that's not all. Lincoln and Congress also just completely ignored the ruling. They stopped giving a shit and disregarded everything the Supreme Court had to say on the subject of slavery and started passing laws to ban it anyway, despite this being in direct violation of Dred Scott. And of course, we can't forget the famous Emancipation Proclamation, perhaps the one thing President Lincoln is most known for, the 1862 executive order demanding that all slave states in southern states be freed immediately. In the end, the Supreme Court was forced to admit that their power had been broken since nobody was enforcing it. And for decades afterward, the court was far less powerful than they had been and than they are today. That's amazing. Think about that. This is what happened in American history. They jumped the shark. They ruined their credibility. The president goes, that's interesting. I'm going to go ahead and not listen to you and do the opposite. Oh, you don't like that? Well, why don't you enforce your ruling with your army? Oh, wait, that's right. You don't have an army. Seems like I'm going to get my way. That's how it works when you have a rogue court, when you have an authoritarian court, which they obviously just fully embraced authoritarianism with their recent decision on Roe versus Wade. The lesson here is clear. The era of emancipation and Reconstruction, arguably the greatest period of democratic expansion in the history of the United States, was only able to come about because the president and Congress openly defied and crushed the power of the Supreme Court. President Joe Biden and the Democrats, who hold all three houses of Congress, have the ability to do the same today. And while I have no confidence that they will, it remains the right thing to do regardless. Power must belong to the people, not the judiciary. Excuse me, two houses of Congress. Some part of my brain got screwy here and conflated the White House as a third chamber, and of course this happens on a thread that's already started spreading. Okay, anyway, so I was just a correction there at the end. Now, look, you might look at this and say, well, I don't know, Kyle, all this sounds far too extreme for me to support. To which I respond, at the very least, what the Democrats could do is get rid of the filibuster on this specific issue of Roe versus Wade, which they have the ability to do. They could do a workaround. They could take exemptions to the filibuster. So they could say, look, on this one issue, there is no filibuster. And then they could pass, with a simple majority, Roe versus Wade codified into law. That is the bare minimum of what they can do. Now, ask yourself, why aren't they doing that? Why has Biden already effectively taken that off the table? Not a good look now, is it? Now, again, so what we're talking about here is historical examples of extreme situations where the presidency had to push back against the Supreme Court. Again, you might say, I don't know, man, some of these seem to go a little bit too far. Well, there's some other suggestions that were put out here by Kate Willett. She says things Biden could do. Number one, set up abortion clinics on federal land inside red states. Now, that idea originally came from Elizabeth Warren. It's a phenomenal idea. This is stuff Biden could do on his own. Let me repeat that. On his own. Set up abortion clinics on federal land inside red states. Huge workaround, huge loophole, would help tremendously. Number two, federal telehealth service for free abortion pills. So there is a pill now that does abortion. I don't know the specifics of it. I don't know, does it work up to what week? I don't know. But Merrick Garland even came out and said they can't crack down on these things. These things will remain legal. Okay, great. So what else are you going to do? Federal telehealth service for free abortion pills would be another great workaround. Number three, funding for abortion clinics and travel vouchers in nearby states. Another thing he could do on his own. And then she says none of this is waving a magic wand because, of course, Biden's refrain whenever anything difficult happens, is like, well, I don't have a magic wand. So Biden gave a speech about this. And, you know, he was wagging his finger and saying the Supreme Court just took away rights. But then effectively, what was his policy reaction? Nothing. Nothing. And I think the most disgusting part of all of this is the Democrats turned around and immediately started fundraising off of this decision. But they didn't fundraise and say, look, here are the goals, here's how many senators or congresspeople we need, and then we're going to do X, Y, and Z. They didn't do that. They just used it to fundraise, and that's it, while espousing no plan and actively shooting down people who do come up with plans. No. I do not accept that. And you should not accept that either. Nobody should accept that. And again, we're going to get to a story in a little bit. The people reacting to what went down here with Roe versus Wade. And suffice to say, people are not having it. The poll numbers are overwhelming. The specific commentary from young people is biting, to say the least. So I want to wrap up with this. So I just gave you a whole bunch of ideas, a whole bunch of history. Hey, here's the way you can respond to this. But Biden effectively, at his core, what is he? He's an institutionalist. He believes in American institutions. He doesn't believe in any, extreme situations existing where you need to get creative. But at the end of the day, if you're an institutionalist and the people who are nominally your political enemies go full authoritarian and you just sit by and let them go full authoritarian, well, then aren't you an authoritarian? So in a weird way, the belief in institutions is self-defeating because you believe so much in the system that when the system goes authoritarian, you don't even acknowledge it. You don't even notice it. You don't even do anything to fight back against it because you think, well, that's just the way it works. So embedded in Biden's deep institutionalism is apathy in the face of right-wing authoritarianism. And I just want to dispel this notion, and this is something that we talked about with the breaking news video when we talked about Roe versus Wade being overturned. I just want to dispel this notion that the right claims to have a monopoly on the proper interpretation of the Constitution. I simply don't believe that. I don't believe that. This notion of, originalism. I don't know what you guys are talking about. We just, whatever the founders intended is what we go with. Now, they don't actually believe that. They don't use that mindset across the board because there are plenty of cases involving gun rights where you have some modern variation of a gun that didn't exist back in the late 1700s or early 1800s. And they say, well, the Second Amendment allows for this gun to exist and be unregulated. But you just said that what the founders believed is the only thing that's relevant. This didn't even exist back when they were around. So how the hell do you know what they would have said and what they would have believed? You don't know. You're just making it up. So they play this pseudo-intellectual game where it's like, oh, this isn't even my opinion on the matter. I'm just telling you a straightforward interpretation of the plain text of the language in the Constitution. Well, therein lies the problem because I think a plain-face reading of the language of the Constitution leads us to a different conclusion. So let me go ahead and read you. Roe versus Wade rests on the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Due Process Clause. In United States constitutional law, a due process clause is found in both the 5th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution, which prohibits arbitrary deprivation of life, liberty, or property by the government except as authorized by law. The U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted these clauses broadly prior to 2022, concluding that they provide 3 protections: procedural due process in civil and criminal proceedings, substantive due process, a prohibition against vague laws, and as the vehicle for the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. Text. The clause in the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The clause in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay. When I read that, I see a very straightforward interpretation that there is a right to privacy. There is a right to a protection against the arbitrary use and abuse of power from the federal government. So again, I'll read it one more time. nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So I would argue if there's a prohibition against the federal government depriving you of liberty, I would argue you have a right to put whatever substance in your body you want to put in your body. I would argue you have a right to gamble. I would argue you can interpret that as a right to, prostitution. The state cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. So I think it's a very plain-faced, straightforward interpretation to say, look, if the state can't deprive you of your liberty, certainly before a certain line in the pregnancy, it's no damn business of the government what you want to do with your body. None whatsoever. Now, you want to have a conversation later on when the fetus becomes a lot more viable and the nervous system is created. Well, that's fair. Maybe that doesn't apply then because you're dealing with, a person almost. And that's what Roe versus Wade allowed for. Roe versus Wade said, hey, in the first trimester, it's none of the government's business. It's none of the government's business. In the second trimester, you can do some health regulations. In the third trimester, if states want to, they can ban the late-term abortions. That was Roe versus Wade. I think that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the language. Now, were the founders specifically thinking about abortion when they wrote this? No. But the founders couldn't think about 70% of the things that we debate today because they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the modern issues, they didn't have the massive industrialized economy. So to try to view it through the eyes, and this is your only way of looking at the Constitution and interpreting law, to try to view it through the eyes of people who shat in outhouses and wore powdered wigs, you are limiting yourself. A much better way to do it, as I described, is read the language, interpret it in a straightforward way, and apply it in a modern context. And, the Equal Protection Clause, too. This is another great one. When they talk about, everybody gets equal protection under the law. Now, at the time, they did not mean black people. They did not mean, because a lot of them had slaves. They didn't mean that. But today we all look at that and we go, well, if we want to really implement that literally, of course we should mean black people. Of course we should mean women. Of course we should mean gay people. Because equal protection under the law, do you really want to be equal? Well, these people are people too, so they count. But now we're at the point where, and Clarence Thomas alluded to this in his decision, he thinks, no, we need to revisit all this stuff. We need to revisit Obergefell, which is the gay marriage case. He wants to revisit a case on the right to contraception. He wants to allow states to ban contraception if they so please. This is a guy who said we should revisit the sodomy case. Sodomy. So if Mississippi or Alabama wants to ban oral or anal, if you get caught doing that, even in the privacy of your own bedroom, they could have a law that's against that and they can arrest you. And Clarence Thomas says that it's perfectly constitutional to arrest people for that. Are you kidding me? That is deeply authoritarian. And if you're not standing up at this moment, are you going to stand up in those moments? We need to stand up now to protect the right to choose. Because then it's going to be, no, gay people can't get married. Then it's going to be, well, you can't do oral or anal. Then it's going to be interracial marriage. Now, Clarence Thomas did not bring that one up. Why? Because he's in an interracial marriage. He doesn't want his rights being taken away. But he brought up all the other rights. Hey, we should redo these cases, reinterpret these cases, because we don't think it's a plain-faced reading of the Constitution. He's looking for excuses to make our government, specifically the state governments, more authoritarian. So, by the way, I also don't want to hear another goddamn word about people on the right being in favor of small government and liberty. This is as big government as you can get, and it is obliterating liberty. They want the states to have the liberty to go full authoritarian and crack down on the people. Their argument is like, well, why not let the states choose what to do? Let's go a step further. Why not let the people choose what to do? How about that? So they've gone full authoritarian. It's not okay. And the Democrats need to do something. And I don't think they're going to do anything, which is what makes this so frustrating. Because it's not a fair fight. It's not an even fight. The right has been planning this for decades with the Federalist Society and packing the courts with extremely ideological far-right wingers. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. And the Democrats are wholly unprepared for the moment. And it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. We got to fight back. We got to change this because, let me tell you something, it doesn't stop here. It gets a hell of a lot worse. Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.